The ground didn't just shake, it screamed. A sound like 1,000 war drums, a thunder that came from the earth itself, rolled across the plains. Dust, thick and choking, boiled up on the horizon, turning the blue sky into a dirty brown canvas. And out of that cloud came the horses. Dozens of them, wild, untamed, their eyes wide with panic as they tore toward the little makeshift market at the edge of town. People yelled, merchants cursed, trying to pull their goods back. Carts were overturned. Folks scrambled for safety, shoving, climbing, doing whatever it took to get out of the way of that living avalanche. In the middle of it all, a young woman went down. She was pale, thin, with eyes that seemed too big for her face. One moment she was running, the next her feet tangled and she hit the packed earth with a hard, final thud. Her little cry was swallowed by the chaos. The crowd just flowed around her, over her, a river of fear that had no time for a single soul caught in the current. Her hands clawed at the dirt, searching for anything to hold on to. All she found was the simple white kerchief she'd tied around her neck, a flimsy piece of cloth meant to keep the dust out. As she fell, her fingers clenched around it, a desperate, hopeless gesture, as if that scrap of cotton could somehow stop a stampede. "Get up!" People shrieked at her, their faces ugly with terror. "You can't stop them!" A few even laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. They saw her there, a sacrifice to the storm of hooves, and they were just glad it wasn't them. Time just stopped. The world narrowed to the sound of pounding hooves, getting closer, closer, like the beating of a monstrous heart. The young woman squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the impact that would end everything. The white kerchief slipped from her grasp. It fluttered up into the dusty air, a tiny white flag of surrender. And that's when he appeared. Out of nowhere, a rider burst from the edge of the crowd, moving with a grace that didn't seem possible. He wasn't running from the horses. He was riding into them. His hair was long and black, held back by a leather cord. His eyes, dark and intense, were locked on the fallen woman. It was as if nothing else in the world existed. Not the stampede, not the screaming crowd, just her. He was a Dakota warrior. His horse, a powerful chestnut, moved like it was part of him, responding to commands that weren't even visible. The crowd gasped as he plunged into the heart of the chaos. In one fluid, impossible motion, he leaned down from his saddle, his arm shooting out like a striking snake. He grabbed her, his arm wrapped around her waist, and he lifted her from the ground as if she weighed nothing. He pulled her tight against his chest, shielding her with his own body, all while his horse was still at a full gallop. Iron hooves hammered the ground all around them, close enough to feel the vibration in their bones. The stampede closed in behind them, a wall of flesh and fury. But the rider never hesitated. He drove his horse straight through the thundering herd, breaking out the other side into the thinning dust, the roar of the stampede finally fading behind them. The woman was trembling in his arms, her mind struggling to catch up. She was alive. She was safe. She looked up, and that's when she saw it. In his hand, the one that held the reins, he'd also caught her kerchief. That little white scrap of cloth, plucked from the air in the same impossible gesture that had saved her life. He held it up for a moment, the white cloth stark against the dusty sky. And in that moment, it wasn't just a kerchief. It was a promise, a testament that even the smallest, most fragile thing could survive the rage of the herd. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was a cold, hard disbelief. Because no one in that town had ever expected a man they called a savage to risk his life for a stranger. His horse skidded to a stop, tearing up the ground, its sides heaving. The warrior held the woman for a moment longer, his grip firm, as if he knew the danger wasn't over. The stunned silence of the crowd broke, replaced by a low, angry murmur. It started with a few whispers, then grew louder, uglier. A woman selling fabric from a nearby stall, her face pinched and sour, was the first to shout. She fell on her own. It was her own clumsiness. Her voice cut through the air, and it was like she had given everyone else permission. "Look at him," a man in a dust-caked hat yelled, pointing a trembling finger. "He holds her like she's some kind of prize he's won." The warrior ignored them. He gently lowered the young woman to her feet, his eyes scanning the crowd, watching their faces twist with a hatred that made no sense. He then held out the white kerchief to her. She reached for it, her fingers shaking. "Don't take it," the fabric seller shrieked. The warrior raised the kerchief higher, letting it ripple in the breeze. It was a simple, clean gesture, but to the crowd it was a challenge. "A dirty rag doesn't change what you are," a merchant spat from his overturned cart. A few people laughed along with him, a bitter, jagged sound. Tears welled in the young woman's eyes. Not tears of fear from the stampede or relief from the rescue. These were tears of shame, of a deep, cutting cruelty from the very people who should have been cheering. They would have rather seen her trampled into the dirt than be saved by this man. He didn't say a word. He simply placed the kerchief in her trembling hands, his touch gentle, like he was passing on something sacred. And that's when the market chief stepped forward. He was a big man, broad and fleshy, wearing an embroidered vest that strained at the buttons. He was the law in this part of town, and his face was a mask of pure venom. He looked from the warrior to the woman, his eyes lingering on the white cloth in her hands. "That kerchief is stained," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Stained by his hands. If you keep it, you carry the disgrace of this whole town." The crowd roared. Some nodded in agreement, their faces hard. Others just looked down, shuffling their feet, caught between their prejudice and the undeniable truth of what they had just witnessed. The young woman looked at the piece of cloth. It suddenly felt impossibly heavy in her hands, heavier than a ball and chain. She clutched the kerchief to her chest, the simple cloth now a symbol of a choice she didn't know how to make. The crowd pressed in, their murmurs growing into a hostile chant. "Throw it down!" a woman screamed, her voice cracking with a strange, frantic energy. "Throw it down before you curse us all!" An old man, leaning heavily on a cane, his eyes rheumy and filled with scorn, hobbled forward. "It would have been better," he rasped, spitting on the ground near the warrior's feet. "Better for her to die under those hooves than to owe her life to a savage." The poison in his words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The market chief, Silas, stepped forward again. He puffed out his chest, the garish embroidery on his vest glinting in the sun. He raised a hand not to calm the crowd, but to incite them further, to become their judge and their executioner. "That rag," he boomed, his voice echoing across the square, "does not belong to you, and neither does the dignity of this town. Surrender it, or be cast out with him." He pointed a fat finger at the Dakota Warrior. The young woman's world shrank to the faces around her, twisted, angry, afraid. Her gaze darted to the warrior, a silent plea for help, for an answer. His strength had pulled her from death, and now she looked to him to save her from this mob. He had been a wall of silence until now. But as every eye in the market fixed on him, he finally spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was deep and clear, and it cut through the noise like a razor. "That kerchief is not stained," he said, his eyes never leaving the chief. "It is alive. I carried it because she had to keep breathing." The crowd erupted. Some shouted that it was insolence, that he had no right to speak. But others went quiet. They had all seen it. They had seen her go down, seen the life about to be snuffed out of her. His words, simple and true, landed with a weight that was hard to ignore. Silas clenched his fists, his face turning a blotchy red. He was furious that he couldn't just shout this man down, that this stranger commanded a respect he himself had to bully people into giving. "Sheriff!" he roared, his voice cracking. "Someone get the sheriff! We won't have some foreigner telling us what's honor and what's shame in our own town." But something was shifting. The children who had hidden during the stampede were now peeking out from behind barrels and carts. They weren't jeering. They were just watching, their eyes wide. They whispered to each other, pointing at the white kerchief, which now seemed almost to glow in the woman's hands. Their innocent confusion planted a seed of doubt in their parents' hearts. The young woman felt a surge of something. Not courage, not yet, but something like it. She lifted the kerchief with both hands, holding it up for everyone to see. The breeze caught it, making it ripple like a banner. A banner of life raised against a tide of hate. A hush fell over the square. For a split second it wasn't just a dirty rag anymore, but Silas broke the spell. "My men," he bellowed, his face contorted with rage. "Seize it! Seize that filthy thing before these people forget who runs this market." And just like that, the moment was gone, replaced by the threat of violence. The chief's men, eager to prove their loyalty, surged forward. They were big, rough men, shouldering their way through the crowd with grunts and curses. The young woman instinctively flinched back, pulling the kerchief tight against her body. It was all she had. The Dakota Warrior moved without a sound. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even seem to tense up. He just placed himself in front of her, his body a living shield, his shadow falling over her like a promise of safety. The air in the square suddenly felt thin, tight. The first man to reach them was a big, broad-shouldered youth with a sneer on his face. He lunged, his hand reaching out to rip the kerchief away. He never touched it. The warrior's hand shot out, catching the man's wrist in midair. There was a sharp, sickening crack of bone as he twisted. The youth screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his broken arm. Another man tried to circle around from the side. Without even turning his head, the warrior slammed his shoulder back, a short, brutal movement. The man went flying, crashing into a fruit stand. Oranges and apples exploded across the ground, a sudden shocking burst of color against the brown dust. The crowd screamed, but now the sound was different. It was a mix of outrage and awe. Some were still yelling for the warrior to be driven out, but others were whispering now, saying it wasn't right, that he was only defending the girl he'd saved. Silas, the market chief, was losing control, and he knew it. "It's a disgrace," he thundered, his arms waving wildly. "If she keeps it, this whole town will be marked by it. We'll be known as the town that let a savage dictate our honor." His words were meant to stir up their fear, their pride, and it was working. But the young woman, with tears streaming down her face, did something unexpected. She lifted the kerchief higher, her chin up, a silent act of defiance. Fear was still coiling in her gut, but something else was growing alongside it. The warrior glanced at her for a single, fleeting instant. A look of approval, of shared strength, passed between them. Then he turned his gaze back to the crowd, to Silas and his remaining men. His deep voice rang out again, clear and final. "If you want this kerchief," he said, "you will have to go through me." The murmuring died instantly. His words were a line drawn in the dirt, a challenge no one seemed willing to accept. The remaining thugs hesitated, looking to their chief for orders. But Silas was beyond reason now. His authority had been publicly challenged, and his rage had boiled over into madness. He let out a wordless roar, and from behind his stall he grabbed a heavy wooden staff, the kind used for breaking up crates. "I will not be defied by a savage in my own square," he screamed, his eyes wild. He charged forward, swinging the heavy staff, aiming to crack open the warrior's skull. The crowd gasped and stumbled back. This wasn't a scuffle anymore. This was a trial by combat, right here in the dust. And the fate of a town was about to be decided by the strength of one man against another, all over a simple piece of white cloth. The heavy staff whistled through the air, aimed with killing force. It was about to crash down on the Dakota Warrior's head, but it never landed. A voice, thin but sharp as a shard of glass, sliced through the tension. "Stop!" Every head in the square whipped around to find the source of the cry. Pushing her way out of the crowd was an old woman. She was bent with age, her face a road map of wrinkles, her white hair pinned beneath a dark, simple veil. She moved with a slow, shuffling gait, but there was a fire in her eyes, a determination that made people step aside for her. She shuffled right into the center of the conflict, into the space between Silas and the warrior. Her trembling, gnarled hand came up, and she pointed a finger, not at the men, but at the white kerchief clutched in the young woman's fist. "That kerchief," she declared, her voice surprisingly strong, "is no common rag." A thick, heavy silence fell over the square. You could have heard a pin drop. The young woman stared at the cloth in her hand as if seeing it for the first time, her mind reeling. Silas, the market chief, froze, the staff still held high. His face went pale for a second, a flash of something that looked like fear, before his usual mask of fury slammed back into place. "I embroidered it myself," the old woman continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. She shuffled closer, pushing past one of Silas's men as if he were a child. "Years ago, for the landowner's wife." She reached out and took a corner of the kerchief in her own wrinkled fingers. She turned it over, showing everyone a small, intricate bit of embroidery hidden near the edge, almost invisible under the grime. It was a stalk of wheat entwined with a pair of initials, and into its stitches, she said, her voice ringing with the weight of a long-held secret, "I sewed the hidden emblem of her lineage." A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was impossible. "This kerchief," the old woman said, her eyes locking onto the young woman, "belonged to the lawful wife of the landowner, and when she was forced to flee, she passed it in secret to her only daughter." She turned her burning gaze on the whole town. "That young woman," she cried, her voice trembling with emotion, "did not fall in the stampede by chance. Fate brought her here today to claim what is rightfully hers." The crowd exploded. It was a roar of disbelief, of shock, of dawning wonder. Some people crossed themselves, whispering that it was a miracle. Others shouted that it was a trick. The young woman stared at the kerchief, then at the old woman, then at the stunned faces all around her. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of revelation. In a single, shattering instant, she understood. This piece of cloth, this thing they had called a rag, a disgrace. It was the proof of who she was, the key to a life she never knew she had. "Lies!" Silas bellowed, his face turning purple with rage. "It's all lies. The old woman is senile. She's raving. Don't listen to her." But it was too late. He couldn't make them unsee what they had seen. He couldn't erase the symbol that now tied this poor, nameless girl to the most powerful family in the entire region. The Dakota warrior, who had stood like a stone statue through it all, gently took the kerchief from the young woman's hands. He held it up high, not as a challenge this time, but as a banner of truth. The murmur of the crowd swelled again, but now it was different. It was a clash of belief and doubt. The square was splitting in two right before their eyes, those who were still loyal to Silas, and those whose hearts were beginning to turn toward the girl and her silent protector. And in that chaotic, beautiful moment, everyone knew. This was no longer about a rescue. It was no longer about a rag. This was about a hidden legacy, a secret that had just been dragged into the light, a truth that had the power to change the destiny of the entire town. Silas screamed with a rage that was almost inhuman. He tore the hat from his head, threw it to the dusty ground, and stomped on it again and again, as if he could crush the truth under his boot. "It's a fraud," he roared, his voice raw. "A trick." Her men, seeing his fury, took it as their command. They started shoving through the crowd again, but this time they were armed with more than just their fists. Some had clubs. One brandished a rusty chain. "The embroidery is fake," one of them shouted, echoing his master. "She's a beggar trying to pass herself off as an heir." The old woman, Mara, stood her ground. "I know my own stitches," she cried, her voice trembling but firm. "I know the memory in my own hands." One of Silas's men shoved her hard. She stumbled back, crying out as she nearly fell. The young woman, Elara, rushed forward to catch her, her own fear forgotten in a blaze of protective anger. She held the old woman steady, pressing the kerchief to her chest. A new determination was hardening her face, chasing the fear from her eyes. The Dakota warrior moved again, placing himself in front of the two women. He was a mountain, an immovable wall. His dark eyes swept over the armed men, and more than one of them faltered, their bravado shrinking under his gaze. But Silas gave them no time for second thoughts. "Tear it from her hands before it bewitches all of you," he shrieked. Two men, emboldened by his command, lunged forward. The warrior met them without a flicker of hesitation. He grabbed the first man by the collar of his shirt, and with a powerful twist of his body, hurled him into the dirt. He didn't even look at the second man, who was swinging a club. He just reached out, snatched the weapon from the air, and snapped it over his knee as if it were a dry twig. The crack echoed across the silent square. The crowd was a cauldron of noise, cheers mixing with shouts of outrage. The town was tearing itself apart. The sheriff still hadn't arrived. Without any real authority to stop it, the chaos was about to boil over into a full-blown riot. Then another voice cut through the noise. "The embroidery is real." A young man was forcing his way through the crowd. He was well-dressed, his face pale and strained. It was Liam, the landowner's son. "It's real," he said again, his voice shaking but clear. "I've seen that same symbol on my mother's things." For a heartbeat, it seemed like this would be the end of it. The heir himself had confirmed it. But Liam's words were swallowed by the storm of shouts. And worse, some of Silas's men in the crowd were now bending down, picking up rocks from the ground. The air turned sharp, tasting of violence. Elara held the kerchief high. She was trembling, but her hand was steady. That simple piece of cloth was her only shield, her only claim. And in that one gesture the line was drawn sharper than ever. On one side was Silas and his thugs. On the other was the warrior, the old woman, and the girl with the kerchief. The tension finally snapped. Silas, his face a mask of sweat and madness, reached into his belt and pulled out a long, wicked-looking knife. "This farce," he roared, his voice breaking with pure hatred, "ends in blood." The knife flashed in the sun, a sliver of silver and death. The crowd surged backward, a human wave receding from the coming violence, leaving an open circle in the dust. This was the arena now. "Don't spill blood here," someone cried out from the edge of the circle. "Somebody stop him," another voice pleaded. But no one moved, no one dared. The air was so thick with hate and fear you could barely breathe. Elara stumbled back, her heel hitting something soft. It was the fresh mound of dirt from a newly dug grave at the edge of the market square. The symbolism was not lost on her. Her face was a pale mask of terror. The Dakota warrior didn't rush. He advanced with a slow, deliberate pace, each footstep landing with the heavy finality of a drum beat. His eyes were locked on Silas, who was brandishing the knife with the wild, unpredictable motions of a man who had lost all control. "No savage," Silas snarled, spitting a wad of tobacco juice onto the ground, "will decide the fate of this town." He lunged. The knife slashed downward in a vicious arc, aimed straight for the warrior's heart. But the warrior was like smoke. He spun, moving with the fluid grace of a panther, and the blade cut nothing but empty air. The crowd let out a collective gasp. Before Silas could recover, the warrior had his wrist. He seized the man's arm, twisting it up and away, forcing the knife skyward. Silas fought back with the strength of a cornered animal, his teeth bared in a grimace of pure rage. He was bigger than the warrior, heavier, and he put all his weight into breaking free. "Stop!" Elara cried out, her voice lost in the tension. "Please, stop!" She held the kerchief aloft as if its fragile threads could somehow end this. Liam, the landowner's son, was still trying to push through the wall of onlookers. "The kerchief is proof," he shouted, his voice thin and panicked. "It's proof." But Silas's loyal men formed a wall, blocking him, their faces set like stone. With a savage wrench, Silas tore his arm free. He immediately slashed again, this time catching the warrior on the forearm. A thin line of crimson appeared on the Dakota's skin. Blood had been spilled. A low moan went through the crowd. There was no turning back now. This would end with one man on the ground. The warrior didn't even flinch. His face hardened, his jaw set, but his eyes remained calm. He planted his feet in the dirt, ready. Silas was panting now, sweat pouring down his face, his chest heaving. He raised the bloody knife one more time. The square was dead silent. Every person there knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that the next blow would decide everything. Not just who won the fight, but who would control the future of their town, their lives, their very souls. And it all came down to a single piece of cloth, fluttering in the breeze like a ghost. The knife came down again, a deadly silver blur aimed straight for the warrior's chest. But this time something changed. In that split second, as the blade began its descent, Elara moved. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She stepped forward, directly between the two men, and held the white kerchief up with both hands. It was a shield of cloth against a wall of steel. It was an act of pure, insane courage. The blade struck the edge of the kerchief, tearing a small gash in the fabric. It stopped less than an inch from her face. The warrior had seized Silas's wrist, his grip like a band of iron, freezing the blow in midair. The crowd was paralyzed. They weren't just watching a fight anymore. They were watching a living tableau. A woman protected by a savage, using a simple kerchief to stop a murderer's blade. Silas thrashed in the warrior's grip, his face purple with exertion. "She has no right," he screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "She has no right to that name. The kerchief is a lie. It should be burned, burned to cleanse this town of her filth." The warrior said nothing. He simply applied pressure. With a brutal, efficient twist, he wrenched the knife from Silas's hand. The blade spun through the air and landed point down in the dust. With a final, powerful shove, he sent Silas stumbling to his knees. The chief knelt there in the dirt, panting, defeated, humiliated. The spell was broken. The crowd roared back to life, a chaotic storm of voices. Some were demanding justice for Silas's attack. Others were still shouting for the warrior and the girl to be driven out. But no one was indifferent anymore. Then Liam, the landowner's son, finally broke through the ring of men blocking his path. He ignored Silas. He ignored the crowd. He walked straight to Elara, his face pale but his eyes resolute. He gently took the kerchief from her hands. The cloth was torn now, stained with dust, and a single tiny drop of the warrior's blood. He held it up for everyone to see. "This is no rag," he said, his voice shaking but clear and strong. "This is the inheritance of my blood, the memory of my mother, and the proof of my sister." The silence that fell was so absolute, so profound, that it felt like the world had stopped turning. The old embroiderer, Mara, collapsed to her knees, weeping with her hands clasped in prayer. The children stared at the kerchief, their eyes wide with a kind of sacred awe. It wasn't a piece of cloth anymore. It was a banner. Silas, still kneeling, spat a mouthful of blood and dust onto the ground. "Even if I lose today," he rasped, his voice a venomous whisper, "this town will never accept a bastard and a savage as its masters." The warrior looked down at him, his face calm, his silence more powerful than any of Silas's shouts. You could feel the tide turning. The heart of the crowd was slowly but surely moving to the side of the girl and the truth she held in her hands. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone knew the next move would decide it all, for good. Silas staggered to his feet, his face a mess of sweat, dust, and blood. His eyes burned with a red, feral light, the look of a man who had nothing left to lose. He knew he was beaten, but he wasn't finished. A low murmur rippled through the onlookers as he reached inside his embroidered vest. He wasn't reaching for another weapon. His trembling hands came out holding a small piece of tinder and a flint. He struck them together. Once, twice. On the third try, a tiny spark caught. A small, hungry flame leaped to life in the palm of his hand. "If this kerchief is an inheritance," he roared, his voice cracking with madness, "then let it burn with all the other lies." The crowd screamed, a genuine, unified scream of horror. They stumbled back, understanding his insane intent. He couldn't win the fight, so he was going to destroy the proof. He was going to burn the one thing that tied Elara to her name, to her family, to her very identity. "No!" Elara cried, a sound of pure despair. She clutched the kerchief to her chest, trying to shield it. Liam lunged forward, shouting, "That's sacrilege! You can't!" The Dakota warrior started toward him, his steps measured and deadly, but Silas brandished the flame like a torch. "One more step," he hissed, "and I'll set her and the cloth ablaze." The square held its breath. The air grew thick with a terrible dread. The little white kerchief, fluttering in the breeze, seemed moments away from being turned to ash. Mara, the old embroiderer, was still on her knees, praying out loud, begging the heavens not to let this happen. A few of Silas's men, seeing a chance to regain control, started muttering that maybe it was for the best. Burn it, and end all this conflict. But then something happened that no one expected. A small boy in the front of the crowd, too young to understand about lineage or inheritance, but old enough to know injustice when he saw it, bent down, snatched a smooth, flat stone from the ground, and hurled it with all his might. The stone flew true. It struck the flint in Silas's hand with a sharp clack. The spark was snuffed out in an instant. Silas shrieked in fury, and in that single moment of distraction, the warrior moved. He was on Silas in 2 strides, his hand clamping down on the chief's wrist. He wrenched the tinder and flint from his grasp and ground them into the dust with his heel until they were useless powder. Silas fought like a wild animal, spitting and cursing, but it was over. His own men, the ones who had been so eager to fight for him moments before, now shrank back into the crowd. They wanted no part of his final, desperate ruin. The kerchief, still clutched in Elara's trembling hands, waved in the sunlight, clean and whole. It had survived the stampede, the hatred, the knife, and now the fire. But Silas wasn't done. Kneeling in the dirt, defeated and stripped of all power, he lifted his bloodshot eyes to Elara. "If I can't burn the cloth," he whispered, a terrible promise in his voice, "then I will make you pay with your life." And with a final guttural roar, he lunged for her. His hands were curled into claws, his face a mask of pure, murderous intent. He was going to tear her apart with his bare hands. But he never laid a finger on her. The Dakota warrior's arm shot out, catching Silas's lunge in midair. He didn't just stop him. He caught his arm with such force that a sickening crack echoed through the silent square. Silas screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, and collapsed into a heap. This time, when the crowd erupted, there was no division. There was no argument. There was only a single unified roar of outrage directed at the fallen chief. Men and women who just minutes before had been ready to cast Elara out now surged forward. They didn't come to help Silas. They came to surround him, to cut him off, to cast him out like the poison he was. Through the chaos, a man with a silver star on his chest finally pushed his way to the center. The sheriff had arrived. He took one look at the scene, at Silas clutching his broken arm on the ground, at the knife in the dust, at the relieved and angry faces of the townspeople, and his own face hardened. He didn't need to ask many questions. The story was written on every face in the square. Silas, the sheriff said, his voice ringing with an authority that had been absent all day, you're under arrest for attempted murder and for defying the known will of the landowner. No one objected. Not a single voice was raised in Silas's defense. The power in the town had shifted, not from one man to another, but from fear to truth. As two deputies dragged the whimpering, defeated chief away, the insults and scorn of the crowd followed him until he was gone. His reign was over. A profound silence fell. In the center of the square, Elara stood, still trembling, but tall. She slowly, deliberately lifted the kerchief. The cloth was dirty, torn, and stained, but as it rippled in the breeze, it held a dignity that no blade, no fire, no amount of hate had been able to destroy. Liam stepped to her side. He placed his hand over hers, his touch gentle, his voice steady for the first time. I recognize my sister, he declared to the town, to the world. Let this cloth be the seal that binds our family, divided for too long, back together. Mara, the old embroiderer, wept with a quiet, fierce pride. Every stitch, she whispered to no one in particular, was a thread of destiny. The children who had watched it all unfold now looked at the kerchief as if it were magic, some raising their small hands as if they, too, wanted to touch the thing that had turned from a rag into a banner. The Dakota Warrior, seeking no thanks, no glory, stepped forward. He gently took the kerchief from Elara. For a moment everyone thought he would keep it, but instead he unfolded it and draped it over her shoulders like a royal cloak. It was an act of coronation, performed in the middle of a dusty market square, before the eyes of the entire town. The silence that followed was different. It was solemn, respectful. No one dared to mock. No one dared to whisper. They all understood. They had witnessed something profound. What began as a random tragic accident in a stampede had ended as a sacred act of justice, of truth revealed. Beneath the hot noon sun, Elara looked at the warrior, a smile finally breaking through her tears. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling the soft cloth against her skin. And in that moment, everyone in that square, and Elara herself, knew a powerful truth. What had once been fragile had become unbreakable. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of truth and courage. And let us know in the comments, if you were in that crowd, would you have been brave enough to stand up for what was right?